Welcome to the Armstrong Williams Show with a former ambassador to the UN, Boyden and former counsel to Bush 1. Mr. Ambassador, it seems like everyone wants to talk about the debt ceiling. The President, Steny Hoyer, Pelosi, Harry Reid in 2006 when this legislation was before then President Bush. The President, all those that I just mentioned, voted for the debt ceiling. Now, the President and many of his colleagues in the Democratic Party are now apologizing for that vote and say they made a mistake. They did it for the wrong reasons, but Speaker Boehner and Cantor and others are not hearing it. They feel that the President made the right vote and that should be the platform in which they build this debate on. Do you think we can read much into the President's previous vote, and just how critical are we in terms of the economy and the crises that we face if we don't get our debt under control?
It's interesting. I saw David Stockman last night at a reception, asked him how to compare this situation with what he was faced with, double-digit inflation and interest rates in the early 1980s. He said this is many, many, many times worse today. So it's very, very serious. I don't know that the President's vote on the debt limit matters. What matters is what he wants to do in the future. His speech was disappointing because it sort of put off any kind of reform, the basic Medicare costs that are driving the deficit. And he seems to want to go back to health care reform, which is unpopular with the American public by a pretty sure majority. And so it's a disappointment. On the other hand, he is engaged, at least to some extent. So that is a plus.
You know, put it in terms of what happens, the pros and cons, if the Congress were to pass and seal the debt, where America, our federal government, must start living within their means. Could that be very disruptive to the economy?
I don't think we can fail to increase the debt limit. It could be disastrous for the country if we can't pay our bills. That would be a disaster. But the Democrats must offer some significant cuts that they have not yet agreed to, and that the President wouldn't put into his speech, and he hadn't put in yet to his budget. So there have to be some signals about major cuts to come, because we can't continue on the path we're on now.
Now, if you were to listen at the President's lip service, many people say, even the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, feel as though that the President is compromising too much with the Republicans. He's moving towards the center, and they're becoming leery of him as their leader. And this is because he put on the table $4 trillion, and the Republicans asked for $5 trillion. But like you just alluded to, this will not take place until 2014. Is this real progress from the President? Can his actions actually match his words, or do you think this is just politics?
I think his speech was just politics. If you don't get a hold of Medicare or Social Security, I don't think you can really make a big dent. And saying he's going to tax the top 2% in the country is not going to get much revenue at all. The rich aren't that rich, and he can't not also increase taxes on the middle class if he's going to use taxes to do what he wants to do, which is the wrong way to go. We need to cut the spending. It's not a revenue problem the government has, it's a spending problem. And he puts off base the principal sources of that spending.
From your experiences, are you of the belief that when the government lowered taxes, there's more revenue into the federal coffers, as opposed to when it raised taxes, there's less money?
Well, there's a lot of public misunderstanding about that politicians exploit. You can raise revenues by lowering the tax rates and broadening the base and eliminating loopholes. And I don't think the rich would, the richer Americans would object to having more revenues come into the federal government as a result of lower rates and broadening the tax base and losing loopholes. That, I think, the Republicans could accept. But that's not what Obama wants to do. He wants to raise rates, and that's just absolutely the wrong thing. Rates have got to be lowered, And when Reagan lowered the rates in the 1987 tax reform with the Congress, the revenues actually increased even though the rates were dramatically reduced. And that's the direction we should go in.
You know, there's a study that came out, that's coming out now from some universities. You know, the president makes the argument that if you're making $200,000 a year, doesn't matter what your status is in terms of your family, your debt obligations, where you live, you're considered rich in America. But the interesting study from some leading universities are now saying that someone in a family making $200,000 a year don't have much discretionary spending. And there's also an argument that they could also probably need subsidy. Because even making that kind of money, depending on your circumstances and where you live, you could be a paycheck away from being homeless.
Well, I think, sure. If you lost your job, you would be obviously in trouble because you probably haven't been able to generate much savings. So the point is to increase the economic growth of this country, solidify the job base, provide a better guarantee of income growth and income opportunity. That's the way to go, and then you don't have to run into this possible cliff of losing a job and being in real financial difficulty.
You know, people in this country, when they hear the name of C. Boyden Gray on television and in print, they see you as an honest broker, that you're not always tainted by the fact that you may have worked for the Bushes and that you're a long-standing Republican. You actually can see the issues pretty clear and pretty fair. I raised that because when we tweeted earlier that we would be interviewing with you today, one of the suggestions were to ask you how reasonable or unreasonable is the House Budget Chairman, Paul Ryan, in asking for almost the substantial dollars that he's asking for in cuts. Is he actually doing this on the backs of the poor and the middle class? And are there areas where he, who is the voice now and the faceplate of the Republican Party, exactly how far and how deep they feel they need to go in order to start being serious about getting our debt under control?
Well, as I understand what he's proposing, it is a cut off of expected future growth, not off of absolute baseline spending now. And what he wants to do with Medicare is to give income assistance to poor Americans and means test richer Americans like myself, so I get less than I would have gotten without the reform. I think that's perfectly fair. I don't need as much income support for my Medicare expenses, even though I'm getting older, as someone with less fortunate than I am. And I think it's very fair what he's proposed. Where I think there are optical problems is on taxes. And again, I go back to the difference between rates and revenue. I think he wants to see tax reform of the kind proposed by the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which would lower the rates dramatically across the board, also eliminate loopholes. I think that would increase revenue growth. And if that were to be the way we help close off the deficit, to lower rates and get better economic growth and more income, I think that would make the package a little more attractive. That's sort of in what he's saying, but it's not explicit. And I think it would help at some point, not now today, at some point to really put the squeeze on Obama about lowering the rates as the Simpson-Bowles Commission has proposed.
Mr. Ambassador, come June 30th, the Federal Reserve, which now controls 70% of our bond market, will relinquish that role. And the United States government will be forced to find and attract potential investors who are willing to assume that responsibility. We realize, and the assumption in assuming that responsibility is going to require higher interest rates. That's going to be the serum that will attract them. But it also means that inflation and hyperinflation, which you've already indicated, has already begun to creep into our market. That does not bode well for the housing market. And it does seem that no matter what the president does to try to find relief for that market and people in foreclosure and housing and in a housing crisis, it seems as though that matter is getting worse. Is there anything from your experience and in conversation with your colleagues on Capitol Hill that we can do to change the crisis? And what would this mean long term when the Federal Reserve relinquishes its role in the bond business come June 30th?
Well, they have to stop because they're going to trigger huge inflation. And when they stop, interest rates will go up. And with our budget deficits, we're going to be paying huge sums in interest, not to help people or to do investment in infrastructure or anything else. It's just going to go to foreigners. So that's why the debt crisis is so important, to reduce the size of this debt, to reduce the amount of interest we have to pay, because those interest rates are going to go up.
Are credit cards in America today an entitlement?
I don't think so. You know, there's been a big switch in the public from credit to debit, which is a signal that the public understands they've spent too much. And debit cards are a way of imposing a little self-discipline on the amount of money you spend. You can't run up a big balance on a debit card. So that, I think, shows the American public understands what's going on, and we need to tighten the belt.
Has the Tea Party lessened its influence since its arrival on the scene and the huge impact that it had not only with statewide and local elections, but the recent presidential election, the congressional election and the midterm? Do you think they're becoming more mature, more wise? Because it seems as though more and more people do believe that the Tea Party has a very pivotal role to play, especially when it talks about America not going the way of Greece and other European countries, and that is bankruptcy. They really believe that America is still the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Well, the Tea Party has not lost steam, I don't think. I would attribute to their pressure the fact that the budget deal of last week contained huge cuts, not as big as advertised, but huge cuts, and that the president has now had to get into the game because he's way behind the curve. And that's all Tea Party, and it's all very, very positive, and it's all very, very good.